Here we are. Gone all the way over here. When we left off, we were talking about patria potestas, the grim sounding and often quite grim set of powers that Roman fathers, male heads of household, were given as part of their right over the private sphere of the Roman state, the household, versus the public sphere, which is the government, the Senate, so on and so forth. Patria potestas. Potestas means power over or possession over, and both work. Yes,
I am admittedly confused by one little part of the slide. What is the exposed children?
we are not there yet.
I just
It is coming. So patria potestas is the power to decide which of your children you're going to raise and whether you're going to keep on raising them. At worst, you have a legal right to kill your child. The reasons that are socially acceptable are things that threaten the future of the state. For instance, if you're plotting to restore the deposed kings of Rome, then your dad, like Brutus, would be honor bound to kill you. This isn't something you're supposed to be happy about, and this isn't something that you're supposed to brag about. And stories where this comes up, where a male head of household has had to kill a child, are very judgmental of the father. So even though this is a right that you have as a Roman father, this doesn't seem for most Roman fathers to result in casual child murder, with an asterisk that we'll get to. Within that, your father can decide who you marry, and if he decides he doesn't like his new son-in-law, he can make you get divorced. If you yourself want to get divorced, things are a little bit more complicated. You almost always have to have your dad getting involved, whether you're a guy or lady. It's about your dad and his alliance to your family-in-law. Likewise, let's see. So we talked about arranged marriages, forced divorces. They can decide to disown children, and there are a few different ways this can happen and a few different reasons. The most harsh version of this is you decide your child is incorrigible, but you don't want to go all the way and kill your kid. You can divorce your kid or emancipate your kid through a mock sale ceremony. And if it's a girl, you only have to do that once. If it's a boy, you have to do it 3 times. This is a descendant ceremony from an earlier time period where your male head of household might have sold you into slavery temporarily to cover debts and such. And then the state put in this 3-time clause where you can only sell your kid 3 times before that's not your kid anymore, which is a wild law to have on the books. But there we are, ancient Rome. And here we get to exposing children. So when a child is newborn, there is a moment where the father comes in, the baby is laid on the floor, and the father can decide either to keep the baby and raise them as offspring of the house, or to refuse to raise the child and to put the child outside and stop giving care to that child. So that's what we mean by child exposure or infant exposure. Coming up with a figure for how often this actually happened in the ancient world is difficult. Certainly, it is a thing that happens. It's a big part of mythology. There's also some evidence from the scientific tradition that doctors are using bodies of children who have been exposed and then die for medical research, which is several horrifying thoughts at once. It's not the first time in history for that to happen either. Look up Burke and Hare in George and Edinburgh for more things to keep you up at night when you're worried about the state of humanity. However, in the plays and literature written about this, the assumption is that not that the baby's just going to be left outside and eventually die, but rather somebody's going to pick up the baby and then enslave them. not much better. But the assumption is that the kid is going to live, and often they're left out with their baby jewelry. And one of the plot points in Plautus plays, although not the Plautus play y'all read, the Pseudolus, is that as adults, somebody will recognize, oh my gosh, that's the charm bracelet we gave our baby when our baby was kidnapped and exposed. They're like, oh, yeah, I was that baby. And then everybody is fine somehow. I feel like if Romans had Am I the asshole, this would get really dramatic very quickly. At any rate, for children who are exposed, many of them would end up enslaved or enslaved and then not cared for particularly well. And then part of the rather large infant mortality statistics that are common across the board in the pre modern world. Without two major things, vaccinations and antibiotics, many children do die. And children die at higher rates in urban areas. And that reality doesn't mean that ancient people don't love their kids any less or aren't heartbroken about these decisions. What we see when ancient people talk about these choices is they happen when the parents themselves are financially desperate, when they're unfree, when the baby would expose an affair or some other unusual and overwhelming reason that would make it difficult for you to raise your baby. The norm, however, for a Roman parent, particularly a Roman father, because this is a Roman father's decision, was to keep the baby. The the legal rights make it look like Romans felt that the ideal father was distant or remote and willing to kill you at a moment's notice. It's a very dark picture if you're just looking at legal rights. But when we look at Romans writing about fatherhood and talking about how that Roman is a good father and that Roman is a bad father and that Roman, what is he thinking? Of which there is a lot of Romans questioning other people's parenting, because human beings have been questioning each other's parenting for a long time. The norm is the thing that you will be judged for is you're not warm enough with your children. You're not supportive enough. You're not spending enough quality time with them. You're not taking them with you to work and showing your children what they need to know when they grow up. You're not sufficiently affectionate with them. You don't hug them. You don't kiss them. You're like hands off. That is considered bad fathering. So the expectation is that this power to kill your children happens alongside with an expectation that you will love your children a lot, so that the punishment of killing your child is for you as much as it is for them. Does this stop some Roman fathers from being abusive and getting away with killing their children? No. Any more than modern child abuse laws stop modern parents from doing this. And look, I'm not defending this model of parenting, but I think that we're doing our ancient friends, I'll call them ancient friends. They're my problematic favorites, the Romans. We're doing them a disservice when we talk about this as a sensationalized, one size fits all, inhumane, thank you, sort of situation. Instead, we've got a complicated set of expectations, feelings, bonding, and desperation in the face of an unsure and insecure universe. Yes. So you could also sell your children into slavery if they were minors. Minor for Romans is under the age of 25. At the age of 25, a son will be able to make their own contracts and sign their own paperwork, but until their father dies, they don't have full legal personhood either. So there's a longer road to adulthood for men than you think. And although women tend to marry earlier, in elite households, alarmingly early, like 14 average, with a decent number in the 12, 13 range. This, however, does not seem to be typical of women outside of this upper class, where there's less of a pressure to do a dynastic marriage and to get that deal sealed as early as possible. So outside of these fancy families, You might make it into middle school without getting married if you're a lady. We hope this for them. Some were in their 20s at first marriage. So, again, there's a range. And then finally, we need to talk a bit about what Romans mean when they say familia. We've talked about this before, but just to refresh. Your familia includes your nuclear family, fathers, sons, grandfathers, daughters, not your wife, unless you're in a very rare kind of marriage. Your wife is in her family of origin. Everybody but your wife, though, is in your family, including people you are enslaving, people you have manumitted, the descendants of people you have manumitted. They're in your family too, because manumission was treated like an adoption. So your familia is going to include people who have come into your family through a variety of means, some of them violent, some of them real problematic. And these ties continue on generation after generation, which has the effect of making Roman families large, diverse, and also, though, something that perpetuates this cycle of coercion, manumission, violence. Enslavement continues to be a feature of this world all the way through the times we're looking at and continues into the Middle Ages at lower rates, but still part of the legal system. And the reason why American history inherits forms of slavery that it does is partly due to the legitimacy that, oh, Romans did it, gives to the practice. Yes.
Out of curiosity, sorry. So you mentioned that the process of manumission is this. It isn't just as obvious as, oh, I'm a decent person. I'm going to free my slave. How often is it the process of the master who manumitted their slave and the former slave deeply, for lack of a better word, toxic, both before and after? I mean, on the face of it, it sounds like they're doing the formerly enslaved person a service that they should have done from the beginning. But
let's talk about the terms and conditions.
Why that it isn't.
Let's talk about the terms and conditions. Starting out with enslaving somebody is a violation of their basic human rights, yes. Which is not just me being a modern person. Ancient people talking about why slavery is in their law phrase it that way. They say there's a natural law of all people and a natural state of the human being, and that natural state is freedom. Therefore, enslavement is unnatural. And when the law is in doubt, the law should bend in the direction of freedom. When manumission agreements are struck, it's a deal that you work out between the person who is currently enslaving you, is manumitting you, and then the details don't immediately give you, bless you, complete freedom from the person who was your enslaver and now becomes your patron. That patron is someone that you're expected to owe fealty to owe respect to, and this is legally and statutorily mandated. On the books, there's a rule that if you are an ungrateful freedman, you can be re-enslaved. So it's a revocable manumission. If you your name is determined by the person who's manumitting you, so you can't pick your own free name. It's the person who last owned you. And often when we're talking about, so there's a category of manumission for women in a sexual relationship with their enslaver where there's manumission specifically so she can then become a wife, which we do not consider a particularly respectful way to go about getting consent for a relationship. So after manumission, often manumission will happen in the will. So your enslaver dies, you're freed in the will. There are quotas on how many people can be freed in a will. And then in your life after that, you have their name on your name. You're living in their community. The heirs in the will, you have to visit frequently, vote for, support when they're running for office. If they have a bill they want passed and you don't support it, you're being ungrateful. And this is happening while you are also now free to benefit from the system yourself. So, freed people are enslaving other people and forming links in a cycle of violence. So, when I talk about, actually, I'm going to frame this one more way. And here I'm going to lean into Frederick Douglass a bit. When he's answering questions from people who are saying, well, what if you have a kind enslaver? What if they aren't beating you up or raping you or forcing you to do heavy labor? Like, is there a universe in which this is okay? And this is in all three of his autobiographies right at the beginning. It's a really good read. So he says, the problem is not about whether you're being treated quote unquote kindly at the moment, but that you have no control either now or in the future. You don't know if you're going to be sold to somebody next week. You don't know what your next enslaver is going to be like. And there's nothing you can do to fix that. So the existential dread is, in and of itself, part of the violence and the damage that comes from being in an enslaved state. And it ruins all natural connections between you and the people you love, the people you're making children with, your children, because at the root of it is this idea that even if the person you have now seems to be behaving okay, there are no guarantees that your next owner is going to behave well. And that works well, I think, for stepping into the psychological horror of what's going on in chattel slavery in general, including Roman chattel slavery. All right. So that was a grim slide, briefly.
Why would in this cycle there be manumission in this case if it's like this? And I mean, other than it seems like the main benefit that the former enslaver gets is that they have a citizen who is beholden to them, but it doesn't even sound like they get full citizen rights. So
Nope, that's it. They're beholden to you, but you no longer have to pay for their food and lodging and board. It's a cost saving measure.
Oh,
And it's also an incentive to the rest of the people you're enslaving to cooperate. Okay. That aside, the norm of what's going on with Roman fatherhood and the thing that Roman fathers want you to know about them when they're showing themselves as fathers, they're expected to be really involved, to be loving, to be responsive to their child's needs, even when their children are really young. It's considered okay and fine to be absolutely emotionally wrecked when your baby dies. And it's something that other fathers see and support. Having your kids with you when you're in the public sphere and including them in things, that's considered appropriate Roman fathering. And if you are a distant, hands off Roman father, you are going to get Roman side eye. We tend to assume that all patriarchies work the same way, and no, each one has a different rule set. And in this one, the expectation is that because your children stay in your family, your wife doesn't. Your wife is part of her family. And the children are her children, but she's having them for your family. So they're primarily your children. You expect to get custody if that marriage breaks up. You're expected to be held responsible for how these kids turn out. You're expected then to be on top of your dad game. And this means sitting with them when they're sick, taking a great interest in their education. And this isn't just for your sons, but for your daughters also. And so when we see Romans bragging about themselves, often they'll brag about what a good dad they are and how involved and how hands on. Let's see. talk about the art I've chosen for this section a little bit briefly. So these are all from funerary art and portraiture. In this one, we have a couple with their two young children, and the artist has chosen to show them both about the same size, which is a way that ancient art shows hierarchy and partnership. So she's not shorter than he is in a really obvious way. And that's typical of Roman art of married couples. It's meant to be a shared project. And then both of them have hands physically on their kids, leading, guiding them, making sure they're okay. That too is part of the visual demonstration of that ethic, that norm. This one is one of many sarcophagi or containers for the remains of dead people, in this case, a dead child, but there are many, many more of them because children did tend to die at high rates in the pre modern world. And when you look at the people who are mourning the baby, as the baby is in this last moments, that's probably his mom with her covering pulled over her face so she can hide her grief a little bit. But the person who's standing next to the baby, hands on face, active, caring, that's dad. And then extended families in there too. Grandpa also is quite upset. And that is how this is supposed to be, at least on paper. So, two things are true when we're talking about Roman law around fatherhood, both these harsh and unlimited rights of violence to the children, and also this expectation that fathers are going to be warm and loving. It's a lot. So let's turn our eye to the other end of the gender binary, which most Romans go with a binary when they're talking about gender. Asterisks, though, they also realize that there are people who fall along a spectrum and also that intersex people exist. So it's a category they're aware of and dealing with. But when they're talking about family structures, they go for a very binary view. So this is going to turn out sounding very binary because this is how Romans shuffle it. I'm going to start with elite women, and then we're going to work our way down into social classes with fewer strictures and less property. Oh, sorry, I did miss talking about. So the two painted portraits are, again, from these mummies in Roman Egypt. And here we have a young girl and a young boy. Poor kids. So another Fayum portrait, another lady, this one venerable, so probably a mater familias. So the pater familias, male head of household, but there is a lady version, the mater familias, the matriarch, is not a bad way of putting this. The sphere of women was the management of the household budget, the household resources, and therefore the household economy. An economy both of physical goods, stored goods, livestock, human property, and the management of resources for the betterment of the family unit. Within that also is the having of children and caring for their health in an attempt to get as many of them to survive as possible, which might on the surface look kind of familiar to modern notions of what traditional women's roles look like. But there are some distinct differences in the economic end of that we're going to tease out a bit here. When we're talking about elite marriage and motherhood, the goal is to choose and support mothers of elite and leading citizens. That means that if you're born into an upper class family female, you're going to be given skills that are felt to be important for supporting the career of your future husband. And this is important to your family of origin because your marriage is going to serve as the linchpin for alliances with political implications down the road. So when you're an upper class woman getting married, your husband sees you as a perpetual ambassador from your family of origin, unless you're in a very rare segment of the population, almost unheard of by the time we get to the first century BCE, where your membership in a family transfers from your dad's house to your husband's house. Almost never happening in the time periods we're dealing with, though. Instead, you are a permanent representative of your dad, and you are acting as the go between negotiator between your dad's family and your husband's family. You're meant to advocate for your dad's family's priorities, for your brothers as they run for office, for your uncles as they pass bills. And you're supposed to do that by means of literacy. So you'd be answering a bunch of letters a day, trying to keep up with your family of origin. You would be having informal in house business meetings, essentially, with members of your husband's family. And you're also, in large part, a spy in the household. You are there to look out for signs that your husband's family might be falling offside. And as we get into the crisis of the late Republic, this is a situation that more and more elite women are dealing with. What the heck do you do when your in laws and your dad are not getting along? Or in Octavia's case, your in laws and your brother. She did manage to hold off civil war for a good 10 years, which was braggable. A lot of respect for Octavia. And this can involve doing a lot of things that we don't typically think of women's work or women's activities in the ancient world like. If your husband is out of town and somebody murders your dad and your brother, you don't have a brother, you can prosecute the murderer for murder. And that's fine because you're doing it for your dad and nobody else is available. Gold star. However, if somebody else is available and you decide to prosecute anyway, then you might get dinged for gender points. Did this stop Roman women? No, it did not. Some of them loved taking cases to court, and we love that for them. At any rate, your main job is to have legitimate citizens. That is, your babies need to be born in a context where nobody is going to cast doubt on who their dad is. And in order to do that at the elite level, there is a code about what dress you wear in your house, out of your house. There's a lot of covering up and veiling sort of modesty norms. But then also there are norms about when you are in public, how do you behave? Are you loud in public? Are you quiet in public? Do you engage in shouting matches with construction workers on the street? That's probably not good. But if somebody murders your husband, sometimes you get a pass on shouting in the street if his dead body is right there and you're getting sympathy. So sometimes you can shout in the streets. It just involves a lot of blood. At any rate, this means that upper class women's behavior outside of the house, their dress, and the people they're associating with are pretty closely monitored and policed. But this is mostly the kinds of men and mixed company you're meeting with. And women had entire parallel social and political structures amongst other women of the upper class. So there were whole women's networks with women's communication structures, due in part to the way this culture separates men's spaces from women's spaces. It creates an opportunity to have a whole life that is unmonitored by dudes. This doesn't necessarily mean it's not policed, because women are great at policing, as anyone who's been on the internet can tell you. Mommy blogs, man, mommy blogs. Jeez Louise. Yeah, be careful where you ask for breastfeeding advice is my free advice there for the day. Dear God. My kid is fine. I'll recover eventually. Anyway, so this is framed for Roman women as keeping your personal honor intact. And your honor is a combination of how you present yourself as reputable and how reputably you actually behave. And this is both a sword and a shield. You can end any number of unwanted interactions by being like, this is dishonorable. This is unworthy of me. I am retiring. You do what you need to do, and weaponized femininity has a long history. So, you're also supposed to raise children who will bring glory to the state. You want to have pietas yourself and also raise children that exhibit pietas, that have loyalty to their dad, to their gods, and to their country. And while your husband is your group partner in this project, a lot of that does rest with you, especially at the early childhood phase. Frequently, too, if you're marrying a man who's older than you, he might die before your kids come of age. So, women are expected to be able to pivot into full-time caretaker. The court will appoint you a male guardian to help you with some of the legal aspects of that, but essentially an older mother of a son who's orphaned is expected to and is allowed to be very present and very active in that son's life. During your life, you're bound to patria potestas, this power of the male head of household. Even after you marry, in most cases, either your bio dad maintains that as you go into your marriage. Rarely it transfers to your husband and then he just gets everything. A lot of Roman women's families didn't like that because it was a way that money could leave their family of origin. So they fought back hard against any property transferring from wife to husband. And that eventually becomes the Roman norm, which makes divorce simpler. Simple divorce isn't a thing. But Roman divorce is a little bit more simplified because there is no community property. There is the property of the wife, property of the husband. The woman's dowry needs to be kept insulated from other money because that's her family's money, that's not your money. Within the walls of the house or amongst the people who are part of the household, the familia, that is the sphere in which the mater familias, the oldest woman in the family, has final say and authority. So, although a husband does have control over the household, he's not expected to run day to day. That's very much wife stuff. And when we think about what a Roman elite wife is doing, scholarship now has been reconsidering the way we have interpreted the evidence. In the 1950s, we tended to look at the rhetoric and see things that looked a little bit more like tradwife TikTok. However, that does not fit what we're seeing Roman women do. When they talk about staying at home, managing the household, and monitoring the economy, what they don't mean is that they're doing cute little curtain projects with the sewing machine and like there is no vacuum cleaner, so they're not like cooking and cleaning except to make other people cook and clean. It's more like because households include large enslaved staffs that have to be managed with labor outputs and quotas that have to be met for the household's overall GDP, as it were. There is a managerial role that Romans mean when they talk about staying at home, working at home, doing the work of the house. Our word economics comes from the ancient Greek word for household management. Household management, oikonomia, is the word in Greek. So for Roman women, the kinds of things they are doing are meant to be executive level managerial stuff and monitoring other people who are doing the actual making, selling, monitoring sort of labor at the elite level again. Although some of them would conspicuously also have crafting projects out to show that, like, yes, I am a traditional woman. Look, I too spin. But their main job was to make enslaved people do that spinning labor. But within that, tasks like, oh my goodness, I hope that noise goes away very soon. What is that? Are we on fire? Okay, let's soldier on. So, weaving, cooking, cleaning, raising children, all, by the way, tasks that modern society tends to minimize the importance of because they are largely mechanized and also outsourced to factories as part of our import export structure. It's not the case in ancient Rome. These are all high value, high return on investment products requiring a lot of professional knowledge and multi step production. So to us, this just looks like vacuuming a couple times a day and picking up the Legos. But in antiquity, this is running a small family factory or sets of factories where we're producing multiple products and selling them. More about what that looks like later. Oh my heavens to Betsy, that is annoying. Forging ahead. We need to talk about Roman women's names. So we talked about Roman men's names, and there are similarities with Roman women. Roman men, just a brief reminder, there's the first name. There are 12 that seem to rotate: Marcus, Quintus, Fabius, Titus, Sextus, names like that, the praenomina. Then there's the family name. So for Gaius Julius Caesar, it's the Julius part. And then a cognomen or nickname. So Caesar and Gaius Julius Caesar tells you the branch of the family. Things are a little bit different for women. So I've given you some examples of guys' names and then what their daughters are called. The rule of thumb is that you take the family name, so Julius, Tullius, Aemilius, the one in the middle, name number 2 of 3. And instead of ending it with us, you end it with a. And grammatically, this makes it a feminine word rather than a masculine word. So Marcus Tullius Cicero's daughter was named Tullia. Thank goodness. Gaius Julius Caesar's daughter was named Julia. And Lucius Aemilius Paulus, Aemilia. But then you may ask, well, what if I have more than one daughter? Is a really good question. You have a couple of strategies. You can tell your audience which one is older. So you end up, if you have 2, with what happened in Octavius's family. You have Octavia Major and Octavia Minor, or big Octavia and little Octavia. Bigger Octavia, littler Octavia. But then what if you have 3 daughters? Well, then you can start numbering them. So you might end up with something like Aemilia Prima, Aemilia Secunda, Aemilia Tertia, and you just keep counting. Sometimes you'll also add the cognomen because it's not just people in your nuclear family who are named Aemilia, but everybody in your extended Aemilius family is going to be named Aemilia. So like, hi, I'm Amelia. Here's my cousin Amelia and my cousin Amelia and my other cousin. This gets really silly really fast. So you might also add the cognomen to simplify things a bit. They'd also use nicknames sometimes. So if one's a blonde and one's a redhead, you might have Julia Flaua, blonde Julia, and Julia Rubra, or what's the other word for redhead? It'll come to me. But this is a convenience that sometimes our ancient authors will not provide to us. So the number of times that as a Roman historian, I have to say, this is a story about a Julia, I don't know which one. About 10% of my professional time, we can't figure out which one. We can figure out the date and from context clues and kind of narrow down on which Julia, but there are a lot of Julias. especially once the imperial family is all Gaius Julius Caesar. So all of the empresses are named Julia with little variations. It's annoying. Oh, Romans. But yes, so if you have a sister, your sister is your dad's last name also, and you just have to work out amongst yourselves who gets which nickname. Good luck. In this model, at at the elite class, which is where we know the most about how marriage works and what the rules look like, to be respectable, to signal that you are a woman in good standing, is to signal your dependence on the pater familias that is responsible for you. This doesn't necessarily mean full dependence and no agency, though. Roman women had a lot of wealth that they owned outright by themselves. Roman law also did not split estates differently between male children and female children. So your daughters and your sons, if you die without your own will by default get equal shares. So this is not a system that is built like what you might be used to from, say, Regency England or 19th century America. However, in order to maintain your respectable aura, as it were, you take a lot of care with how you dress when you're outside of the home, how you dress when you're receiving visitors, which is a thing that you do. If your husband's out of town, you might take his business meetings, but you'd have a chaperone, you'd make sure that it all looked above board, and so on and so forth. But as you aged, particularly once your father died, and probably your husband would die a little bit later, although with the way elite marriages are, not necessarily. A lot of old dudes getting married. Once they're dead, you are given guardians who seem in practice to be much more willing to rubber stamp whatever it is you want to do legally and socially to a certain extent. We also have evidence of upper class Roman women who are not following all of the respectability rules and still managing to have an active political and social life and get on with themselves. So, as per usual, the rules and how people actually behave are two very different universes. And sometimes when a society is policing something with extreme energy, it's because people are not following that rule and folks feel it needs to be enforced. So I mentioned that women are meant to be economic partners as well as domestic partners. And this is not as weird of a concept for Romans as it is for us because of the nature of workplaces in the pre modern world. With the Industrial Revolution moving large scale factories into the economy and thus having many workers leave their homes to go work in a third location for most of the day and then return to their houses, historically, that was weird, at least weird for freeborn people. Early versions of factories take off in situations where there is enslaved labor. So you do get versions of large factories superimposed on enslaved labor in places where that's happening. In ancient Rome, there are some factory or quasi factory spaces, but they don't seem to be as far from the place where enslaved people are living. And they also seem to be areas where there's room for you to bring family members and to have more of a mixed group in the area. So, work rules that we're used to today, where you leave your personal life at home and you just show up for work on time and act like you don't have a family, that would be super weird for ancient workspaces. But then also the idea that the home is not a workspace would blow ancient people's minds because your home is a workspace in the ancient world. You are expected to be working on projects all day because this isn't a factory economy, at least not in the sense we're used to, with mass production and easily accessible stuff. Rather, this is a situation where the cloth that you wear, the shoes that you put on, the bread that you eat, everything you need to live bits of your life, either you're making it home or you're buying in surplus from a home that's making a little bit more of it. And this means that part of what you're doing inside your household is you're choosing which products to make surplus in order to sell, to have coinage so that you can buy stuff that you're not making yourself. So, when we talk about women running a household in antiquity, what we're talking about is women as quartermasters. They are making economic decisions, running small businesses, and figuring out ways to keep everybody from starving. They're also having to motivate a workforce that includes unfree labor and doing that in ways that are sometimes, actually, no, I think intrinsically dehumanizing, and many of which do resemble some tactics that we see in later factory workplaces. Like, for instance, productivity quotas or limits on rest time based around how much stuff you produce, or limiting food intake based on how much wool you spend that day. It could get pretty dire. We're looking here at two portraits of Roman couples. On the top, we have a baker, Terentius Neo, and maybe his wife. We're not sure who the lady is. She's not labeled in the painting, but probably his wife. He's got a scroll, which shows that not only is he literate, but he reads for fun as well as for business reasons. And then she's got wax tablets, which is a writing technology you use to do the budget. It's a little bit like having your balance book or your accountant's ledger or an Excel spreadsheet in your hands. So she's got the spreadsheet, he's got the scroll, and they're equal to each other in terms of height. They're both in the frame together. And he's wearing his toga, which shows that he's a Roman citizen man of substance. This portrait taken together is bragging not just about, hey, I'm Terentius Neo, my bakery business has made me an important dude, but he's also saying, hey, here's me, here is my wife and our business. My business is a family business, and my wife is my right hand. Like, she's literally sitting on his right hand in here. And that's the optics and the goals that Roman marriage is aiming for, this sense of partnership and equal participation in a shared bottom line and business structure. A little less formal here. And this is from funerary art. This would have eventually been, I think, on the side of a sarcophagus or covering a niche for cremated remains. This is a baker and her wife working at their family, or sorry, no, she's not a baker, she's a grocer. And she and her husband are working at their family grocery. It's kind of a bodega sort of situation. Often these shops were in the front of the family home. So you'd use your street front property for your shop, and then you'd live in the back. And here there's a counter area, and then there's a shop floor. And the slightly larger dude with the beard is the proprietor of the shop, welcoming his customers and monitoring what's going in, what's going out. Then behind the counter, his likely wife is monitoring sales, taking in coins, making sure people don't run off with the figs. And then on the countertop, there are a couple of naked toddlers. That's their kids. So every day is bring your kid to work day in ancient Rome if you run a business. And it was really normal to just have your kids there because you have kids and that's your workplace. It's also your house and you're doing business out the front. And it's perfectly fine once you get out of the senatorial ranks for a woman to be front and center in running that part of the family business. And when her husband dies, if his will is set up, she would be most likely to inherit it in trust for their kids when they grow up. We don't know as much as we would like to about the intellectual lives of women in the Roman world. However, we know that upper class women were expected to be literate. There's some sign of basic literacy outside of upper class folks as well. Uh, one of those pieces of evidence is on the inside surfaces where only people working there would see in a brothel in Pompeii. We have graffiti that seems to have been written by the sex workers there rather than by their clients. Like, why would you graffiti while you're doing that is a question. But the graffiti does seem to be written by folks who are working in that brothel. And they are coherent, readable bits of language. So this indicates that literacy isn't just for elites, it's happening outside of elite spaces too. Also, just the general density of graffiti in ruins of Roman towns. Pompeii is a great example. There are political ads, there are ads for businesses, there's rude things about somebody who, I don't know, pooped on the wrong doorstep. Uh, Stuff that ranges from petty character assassination to vote for Marcus. This indicates that you have enough people who can read in your society that there is a point to writing rude things about what Marcus's poop looks like. It's just a way of giving somebody a gold star, I guess. So, bathroom graffiti is a sign that education is working. We think that literacy for women certainly existed in the upper class. Functional literacy, we're finding more and more evidence that it's happening for middle and working class women too. And literacy is a misleading metric as well, because this is a time when the norm is you don't read something quietly to yourself, in part because spaces between words haven't been invented yet. Also, capital and lowercase letters have not been invented. So imagine that every book you read is written in caps lock with no punctuation, like a bad YouTube comment. You have to read it out loud to figure out what's going on. We have other evidence that tells us that Romans would habitually read out loud. So if somebody is reading, other people would hang out and listen to the book being read. So you could have a very broad education and be functionally illiterate because you'd hung out next to people who were reading out loud. And as we get into the end of the first century BCE and second century CE, public libraries become more and more a thing in ancient Rome where they're affordable. You can go hang out, listen to people read from the books there. And we know that there's at least enough shared education in Rome because we get graffiti that is like the Onion making fun of epic poems like the Aeneid or the Iliad and the Odyssey. Yes.
So, so how, like you mentioned earlier that that texts in Rome were written for the ones that meant to be lasting a long time were written on the vellum taken from animals, and
Yeah.
that the wax tablets were used for writing, and that parchment is basically for brief notes that'll rot away in a day.
No, parchment is the vellum.
Uh,
I think you're thinking papyrus, but no, papyrus also is long lasting.
you mentioned some sort of good lasting paper that didn't last long in past the Roman times.
Where are you going with this?
Mostly, I was just wondering what sort of medium was used on these libraries. If it was inexpensive enough that it was able to be stored easily, but obviously most of it does not sound like it lasted to modern day.
Papyrus and sometimes vellum.
Okay, it seemed odd given that the vellum was described as so ridiculously expensive to make.
I mean, it is, but one of the things wealthy people love to brag about was paying and stocking libraries. And it's an archival book. Papyrus is the most likely substance for a library in this time and in this place. Okay, so we have, gosh, I always forget when this, okay, we've got enough time for this. Let us talk about Roman marriage ceremonies. The founding myth for the Roman marriage is the myth of the, or myth, they felt it was history as well. The story of the Sabine women, which you may recall, is this incident where Romulus and company could not get enough fathers to willingly give them wives because Rome had recruited its early population from other people's criminals. And so they invited the Sabines to a chariot race. There was a real chariot race. And then at a certain signal, just grabbed the women and ran behind the walls. And that is the marriage of the Sabine women. So some of the ceremonial forms in Roman weddings are callbacks to the Sabine women incident. And yes, Romans did realize there was some cognitive dissonance there. For instance, while a bride was being led through the cities, there would be a ritual call of Talio, Talio, that was felt to be a thing that happened with the Sabine women, where a rich dude named Talio didn't want to grab his own captive, so he got some hirelings to do it. And then as they ran through the street, they were saying, Talio, Talio, she's for Talio, don't touch her. Wild thing to do at your wedding. But we do all kinds of wild things at modern weddings too, like garter tosses is a that's a thing that happens sometimes. Again, not everybody's marriage. The legal end of a Roman marriage is a contract wherein the two people agree to have legitimate offspring. So, this is something that you were doing to create the future bloodline of the husband's family as a show of alliance from the bride's family. So, this link means that the bride's family is now in an alliance with the husband's family, and the bride's family benefits only in that connection because the children born of that union belong to the husband's family. So there's a bit more in it for the husband's family than the bride's family, but it is a time honored way to make it clear which families you're working with and who you don't like. There are two different legal categories of marriage. The first is the most complicated and also the most rare in the periods we're dealing with in this class, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Because in later years, it makes a comeback, and this is now how modern legal systems, at least modern legal systems using European law, tend to make marriage work. So this one's going to sound more recognizable to us than the more normal one in ancient Rome. So this is a marriage cum manu. Manus is your hand. So this is a marriage where not only do you get the marriage and the benefits of the children, but you also get hand. And what we mean by you get a hand is not that we like chop off hands and you like gross. Rather, the in-handedness. So a daughter is under the protection of her pater familias, right? He's holding her hand because she's daddy's little girl. And if that holding of the hand passes to the husband, where you're like, yeah, the husband gets to now permanently hold that hand, it makes your husband your quasi dad for legal purposes, and you are his quasi daughter for legal purposes. And they did not think that this was weird, but modern ears, it's a little weird. In a manus marriage, there is no separation of property because you have taken over full legal possession of your wife. So her property, anything that she earns or generates during the course of the marriage, the children, everything belongs to you. Her family cannot come back and repossess any of that. It's gone from them now. Also, her father cannot come back and say, yeah, you actually suck as a son in law. I'm making her divorce. That does not happen in this kind of marriage. This was a marriage that by the time we get to historical periods, only very elite, very old Roman families were doing. And you needed to do it in order to hold certain hereditary priesthoods, like the priesthood of Jupiter. In some cases, actually, I'm not sure how this relates to being Pontifex Maximus. By the time we get to the late years BCE, they started having trouble finding enough priests to hold the priesthoods, and they had to start removing this requirement because this was felt to be way too much control for a father to give up over his daughter, and people just were not doing it. Not necessarily for women's rights reasons, but for her family of origin's rights over their inherited wealth. So, Manu's marriage can come from three different kinds of ceremonies. So, this next list of ceremonies is just the ritual you go to get married. The first one is the fanciest, and it's going to be the one that sounds the most familiar. It is the confariatio, or the sharing of the barley cake. This was a barley cake soaked in honey, and you and your spouse would each take a slice of cake. I don't know if you'd squish it messily into their mouth or not, but you'd each have a piece of cake. So if you've wondered what's up with the cake, that seems to be what's up with the cake. The bride would also wear a veil to this ceremony. It was orange, but it was a veil. It was called the flame veil or the flammeum. And her hair would be parted with an iron spearhead, symbolizing her fidelity and her understanding that she's part of the Roman military complex and that she's going to raise her sons to be strong, fighty, stabby sons, and so on. But her hair is parted into 7 sections and braided into 7 braids for the 7 hills of Rome. And then all of this is put up into a headdress with the veil. And then so she's picked up at her dad's house, and there's a procession to her new husband's house. They pause at the door to make offerings of olive oil and wine that you pour onto the doorstep. This makes the doorstep slippery, so at that point, your new husband picks you up and carries you over the threshold, which is what that's about, into the room, and then he offers you gifts of fire and water. Fire because you are now in charge of keeping the house lights on, and water because you are in charge of all of the tasks requiring water. It's a missed opportunity. Nobody gave me a pot of fire at my wedding, and I feel like I was robbed. At any rate, confariatio is this fancy kind of marriage ceremony, and it is associated with Manus marriage, but you don't have a Manus marriage from it unless you stay a full year in your husband's house. If you take 3 nights off to couch surf with anybody else, that breaks the cycle and you remain in your family of origin's house. So, in other words, Roman women for generations would regularly spend 3 nights at their dad's and come home, and they would then retain some control over their dowry with their dad as their legal go between, not their husband. Eventually, this was felt to be just silly and inconvenient, and Romans stopped doing it as a way to renew their legal independence in marriage. Marriage ceremony number 2 option. And this one is much less expensive and much easier. This is the coemptio, where you fake sell the bride to the husband and his family, where you show up with scales and they bring like a bronze coin, and you're like, yeah, good enough. She's yours. This is also the ceremony used for manumission of enslaved people, and it's a ceremony used to emancipate your children if you want to do that. So this one gets a big workout. The final one is the least trouble, and that is usus, which is just Latin for use or habit. And this is where you move in together and you act like you're married. And after a year, you're married. You just make sure you take your 3 nights off. And it's a perfectly reputable way of getting married. You can save a lot of money on a Roman marriage. I'm not sure if I'm advocating a Roman marriage, but the ceremonies at least are affordable. There are dowries in ancient Rome, but dowry in this context means a part of the wife's family property that is an advance on what she will get in her father's will. And it's money that, in most circumstances, unless there's manus in the marriage, almost never happens, it stays with her, and her husband can't touch it. He can't use it to pay bills. She can't even use it to pay for a gift for him. Like, if your wife uses her dowry to buy you a fancy new racehorse, that's illegal. It's not your racehorse. It's hers because it's dowry money. And that's felt to be a protection of her family's interests, her father's interests. So, if, however, you are convicted of adultery, of cheating on your husband, there are ways that your husband can get some of that dowry as a fine to compensate him for you not holding up your I won't cheat part of the marriage vows. But in the normal course of business, that dowry stays out of the husband's hands and it serves as a nest egg for the wife. This doesn't mean that she can touch it either. She often needs a representative from her family of origin to say, yeah, it's okay to use that money for this. When we get into the empire, a new legal construct enters Roman marriage, and that is the jus triorum liberorum, which translates as the law or the right of three children. That is, if you are a freeborn Roman woman and you have three babies, and it's not clear how long they have to live, just do you have three live births, seems to be the rule. Once you've had three babies, you no longer need to have a male guardian to access your dowry or to handle your estate at all. You're considered a full adult and capable of doing your business stuff on your own. And a lot of women who had not actually had three children petitioned for and got this right without the babies as a recognition of their general businessiness and ability to manage their own affairs. If you had been enslaved, so for freed women, you had to have four babies to get this right, which is not fair. And you couldn't count any babies you had while you were enslaved. They all had to be born while you were free. And since in many periods there was a minimum age of manumission at 30, I say as someone who had a kid in my 30s, that's a big ask. That's not quite fair, Augustus. Yes, so I did mention adultery, and that's where we are going to go next, or at least we're going to start in on adultery. Adultery was the big deal breaker of marriage. Although divorce was pretty easy and there didn't necessarily need to be cause for divorce if the wife's family was in support of it. For instance, if your husband was violent to you, your dad could initiate the divorce and you didn't have to prove anything, that divorce would go through. Or if your husband had a fight at Roman Thanksgiving with your dad can also make you divorce. So, don't get too excited. But there are a lot of things that your dad can do to bail you out should you end up in an unsafe situation. Within couples, though, the reasons that the couple themselves could decide to split and split in a way that gives the husband more money than he had at the beginning, almost all of them have to do with adultery because these are unions made for making legitimate children. If you cheat, you are then making it uncertain whether the babies born into your family are your husband's babies. Therefore, adultery was felt in the Republic to be a very serious family law matter, and then it was criminalized in the early empire, which eventually ends up with the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, which is Latin for the Julian law about adulterers who have to be stopped, the adulterers who must be stopped. It's meant to be a zero tolerance policy, making it incredibly damaging for anybody to be remotely involved in any part of adultery. How ridiculous this gets, we leave to another class because it is quite something. Which means we are a little early, but I'm gonna leave you there. Take care, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again.